the events that transpired with him back in the 1930s is one of the darkest pages in medical history. And this was an individual that had studied with Zeiss Optical. He did have a degree as a doctor, Dr. Royal Reif. He was a doctor of pathology, a pathologist. And so his primary concern in his studies was finding the causative agent of disease, looking for the pathogens that were related to the problems that people were experiencing in life. And Reif was supported by a man named William Timken, because Reif did a lot of work for a lot of people. He was very innovative. He was a genius. He had experience in so many different modalities of science where most people would need a team of scientists around them or experts to develop some idea. Reif had enough knowledge in his head by the 1920s that he could virtually call on any of these things in his head that he had studied and build it himself. He was an incredible individual. What Reif was thinking about was this, that a cancer cell is a healthy cell that has had its genetics altered. Something has changed. And as a pathologist, he only knew of one type of organism or critter or whatever you want to call it. We call it viruses. That's what he called them, virons, viruses, that could overwrite instructions. That's why he began looking for a viral link. 20,000 times he got samples of cancer from the hospital, and he couldn't find it. And so you can imagine the time involved. And then he ran into a man named Kendall. And Dr. Kendall said, I can grow cancer. They began having a discussion. And Reif looked at him. He said, well, if you can grow it, he says, I can see it. And so they teamed up. And this was called the Kendall median, is what it was called. Because what Kendall had discovered, that by putting cancer cells into an acidic environment, a low pH environment, that cancer would reproduce and replicate much faster. And what Reif had been doing 20,000 times was taking his samples and putting them into a neutral pH, probably was 7.3. And by the time he was digging down for something that he could find, it wasn't there anymore. And so what Reif discovered early on working with Kendall was this, is that the terrain or the pH levels of the human body will affect whether cancer is there in many cases or cannot be seen there at all. So Reif named the first virus the BX virus. Later on he identified a BY virus. And he would extract these viruses, and here again, this is still available on film, and he would actually inject these into his laboratory rats. Over 200 times, he was able to demonstrate tumor growth. And there's film of tumors the size of golf balls on these animals. And then he would re-extract the cancer from that tumor, and he would apply his frequency machine to the virus that he would put under his microscope, find the correct frequency, then treat the laboratory rats, and their cancer would go in remission. And this is how he demonstrated what he was trying to do.
Let's begin by taking a look at this picture. This is the beginning of our video. These are human leukemia cells, a cancerous type of blood cell. The typical leukemia cell is here. It's just a round little sphere or globe shape. So you can see we have many normal looking leukemia cells as seen here under the microscope. Now when I start the video, you're going to see that this cell, cell number 1, is going to try to make a copy of itself, what they call a daughter cell. The cancer is attempting to replicate itself, but because we are hitting the cells with our pulsing electric fields, you're going to see that the cell will be prevented. So let's run the video. And you can see a daughter cell tries to emerge here, but instead the new cell is immediately shattered by our electric fields. If I let the video continue, you'll see that the new cell is broken into many, many tiny pieces or fragments. Now you can see the cell is just shattered into many fragments, and those fragments are now going to be pushed away. They're going to separate and disperse. The cell is not only destroyed, it's dispersed across the slide. Let's take a look now at this cell in the middle. Another leukemia cell also tries to divide. I've stopped the video, and for a brief moment you can see that a new cell is trying to emerge, but already there's some fragmentation. Now as I start the video, you'll see the new cell is sucked back into the original, and the original cell is actually destroyed, and if you look carefully, you see that the contents of the cell have all been pushed to one side. You see how it's very clear looking here, and here there's more material. So this cell was stopped from duplicating, so was this cell, and this cell is actually destroyed.
And so later on, around 1934, other people were getting involved with Rife, other doctors, some of the leading doctors of the time were now associating with him, looking at his work. Dr. Milbank Johnson was the most notable of that day, well known throughout the country. And he arranged for a study from the University of Southern California to send 16 cancer patients to a ranch in order to test out Rife's theories about using a frequency-based device to agitate the viral link to cancer to see if their cancer would go into remission. Now what's interesting, and this is on audio tape, a few years ago audio tapes were discovered. I think they were discovered up in Canada. And on those tapes you could hear Rife talking about pH levels. And he made the comment that if they did not elevate the pH levels of those 16 studies, that he would get nowhere. Because what he realized was this, that in the right terrain, cancer could replicate itself faster than he could destroy it. Now, what else is interesting about Rife, when he was looking through his microscope, he discovered something else, and it's called pleomorphism. Now, in the world around us, the visible world, we may see a caterpillar become a butterfly. But what Rife saw, depending on the terrain or the pH levels or the toxins that were in his samples, is that not only would he see caterpillars eventually grow into butterflies, he would see butterflies revert back to caterpillars. So what he began to understand is that cancer is developed not just by the virus itself, but by the terrain that it's growing in. What Rife understood back in the 1930s, once he made these discoveries, is that cancer was a symptom of other problems. And if you treated just the symptoms, you would not eradicate the cancer. You may appear to put it in remission. You may appear that you're getting tumor shrinkage. But in reality, cancer is a symptom. Could be a symptom of a problem with pH. Could be a symptom of toxicity. He knew that. It could be a symptom of some blockages within the body itself that's causing toxic buildup. And so this is something that was not understood well by most people. Now, after that study, a man named Morris Fishbein, who was connected with the AMA, tried to buy out Rife and his ideas. So he made him a monetary offer, and Rife refused. He was not interested in money for his research. Now, William Timken, who financed Rife's work, it was a Timken ball bearing company. So he had unlimited resources. And the reason he financed Royal Rife was Rife had saved him millions by developing something to do with his manufacturing process. It saved William Timken millions of dollars, so he always contributed to Rife in his research. Other doctors of the day, just like today, they were financed primarily by the pharmaceutical companies. And this is another reason Rife was not in bed with Big Pharma or the drug companies of his day. He didn't need to be, because he was financed by a man that made ball bearings. See? Well, around 1935, 36, 37, 38, 39, by 1939, this Morris Fishbein, once he found out he couldn't buy out Rife, other things begin to happen. Things begin to disappear. Some of Rife's research, lab notes, some of the components to his microscope disappeared. A frivolous lawsuit was brought against the Beamray Corporation that built the frequency devices, which they won, but they were financially bankrupted. Another plant that was working to duplicate Rife's results burned to the ground. Two other individuals that were supporting Rife, they mysteriously died. They said they died of a suicide. They poisoned themselves. And Milbank Johnson, Dr. Milbank Johnson, he was going to deliver a speech, and he had documents, further documentation validating Rife's work. This was in the early 1940s. The night before that speech, he was found dead in his hotel room. Now, he was buried, and according to reports, his body was exhumed, and it was found out that he did not die of natural causes. What happened to Royal Rife around this period was by 1939, he began feeling the stresses of everything that was happening. And William Timken had passed away, and so had his wife. His financial backing disappeared, and the Royal Rife, unfortunately, degraded into alcoholism and was not heard of much till around the 1950s, and just even then, not much. John Crane had met Rife, and he tried to rebuild or reconstruct some of Rife's devices. He didn't have the financial backing to build plasma devices like Rife had built and that you see here. So he would buy these Heath kits. I don't know if any of you remember, you got to be up in years, remember the Heath kit company. But you could build your own frequency generators very inexpensively. And they used pad-type devices. John Crane did. Now, in the early 60s, Crane was indicted, and he was put in prison. And then I think it was around, I may have my numbers wrong, I think it was around 73, when Royal Rife passed away. He died from alcohol and Valium. He was in an automobile accident, and they took him to the hospital, and then they gave him too much Valium. And the combination of the two resulted in his demise at that point. So that's the last Royal Rife was heard of. John Crane, it seems like, and I don't have the exact dates, my memory is he died somewhere somewhere around the late 80s, early 90s, so he's been gone for a while. The universal microscope is still in existence. I talked to the man who has access to it. He says that it's still functional. The original Beamray machines, not sure if any of those are around. There are reports. Some of the later stuff that John Crane and Rife worked on are still there. There was an eBay auction here just 2 weeks ago with one of Rife's early microscopes and one of the later Rife frequency generators in the 1950s. So some of this stuff is still around. See?